Okay, so I hope that people will now come back to the main stage for our second keynote. And it is really a pleasure for me to have Andrea Evers here. I will now also enter her into the stream. So this is time for our second keynote by Andrea Evers, who is a very interdisciplinary, has a very interdisciplinary background, and is a professor of health psychology at the University of Leiden, and also has a medical Delta Professor Health Society at University of Leiden, TU Delft, and Erasmus University Rotterdam, if I'm correct, which is quite a title. So I'm very pleased to have you here, and we are really excited that you agreed to give a keynote. So I will give the word to you now for this second keynote of today.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, I hope so. So I'm so honored to be invited, of course, for this very interesting lecture, Food for Psychologists, particularly because, in fact, this is not really a typical area where my lectures are about. I'm not really an expert in the area of open science or responsible research practices. I'm more or less an average psychologist who makes use of all these techniques and is also interested in open science. So I discussed this also with Dan. So are you sure you would like to have me as a keynote speaker? But said, no, it's fine. It's particularly what we want, this user perspective. So I think indeed it's important that we share all our struggles and of course also our ambitions in this area from our own perspective, and that is what I would like to do today. First of all, of course, I would like to thank some colleagues because I'm not really an expert in this area. So I contacted several colleagues from, what's your opinion about it? Also the material, for example, Anna van het Veer is using, is very committed to the open science community in our faculty, and gives also a teaching course in the area of responsible research practices. Rebecca Schaefer is also very committed to the open science community, and our data managers of our department, Judy Veldhuizen, Japille Mink, and Francine Broekman. So thanks to all of them, because I could use their slides and their input for this lecture. That's great. So a little bit about my background, because I think that's also important in the area of responsible research practices, because I studied psychology, but then I moved to a medical faculty at the Radboud University. And what I saw is that in terms of open science and responsible research practices, there's really different worlds in different disciplines. And that's strange in a way. That when I, for example, was professor there at the medical faculty in 2010 or 11, there was a lot of discussion already about open science. And when I came to Leiden University in 2013 in the social science, I felt that, the social science could learn a lot from the medical science. But at the other way, both can learn from each other. But usually what you see that there's not a lot of interdisciplinary work to learn from each other. And that's quite strange. So we implemented, for example, our data management system from the medical faculty into the social science at our institute. And I think this is what we need in the future. So it's very important to learn from each other. However, the most important point is there, of course, that it's always not black and white when we discuss all these things like responsible research practices, open science, and others. We, of course, know all these extreme cases, but that is not what's really important. What's really important is, of course, is our daily struggles with the gray matter. So what are the challenging things what we see that we strive, for example, for open science, but there's not enough time for it. We are not rewarded for it. When we look back, for example, our own publications 10 years ago, what do you think about the own quality in terms of now of open science, of sharing everything? There's a lot of gray matters. Or, for example, do we discuss all these struggles, what we have, for example, with with pre-registration, making choice for the best analysis? Usually not. There's usually not really a culture to talk about these gray matters. And I think we should talk about it much more. One way to talk about it we initiated was when I was part of the Young Academy. When I started the Young Academy in 2013, every new members have to focus on a new project, a year project. And we decided to focus on the project on gewetenschap. And gewetenschap was to make responsible research practices, to talk about it and to make it visible. And how we did this was we interviewed our colleagues, so we interviewed ourselves with 50 members of the Young Academy and asked ourselves, what is your gray matter? What is your struggling thing when you're thinking about responsible research practices? For example, your own quality of the work, or when you look in the past about publication bias, which studies did you not publish, for example. So we tried to ask them in a very open manner all to tell about these personal struggles. And we collected this material, and then we hired a professional writer, and he made a theater performance of it. And then we visited all universities with this theater performance, and it's still available. And of course, introduce it to colleagues, and the theater performance usually ends with an open discussions with the audience about all these gray matters. And that's, I think, it's a nice way to introduce, to share this discussion about our own discussions, our own struggles about how to strive for the best, and of course to look what we are doing now in real life and how we can support each other in these things. And of course, one of the main communities, what is so important at this moment, is of course the great open science community. It's not only active in Leiden, it's almost at many other universities at this moment, but I will show you some slides of the open science community in Leiden. And these topics of research integrity, transparency, open data, of course, they're all connected. And it means a change, indeed, a change in the research culture we have, that we talk about these things and that we strive at least for the best in these topics. And one way is, of course, is very important, is teaching. So what said before, that Anna van het Veer developed a specific course of responsible research integrity, where she discussed these principles in every stage of the research life cycle, because it's of course obvious that it's important not only to think about responsible research practices when you publish your work, but already in advance. But why? Why we should indeed talk about responsible research practice? And I think it's a crucial question for all of you. We can talk about all these technical things and what we should do, and of course it's not it's irresponsible if you do not follow responsible research practices, but yeah, you think a little bit from an external motivation. But I think it's much nicer to ask yourself why do you think that you want to follow and do some responsible research practices? And I think there's only one answer, at least for me. And for me, it's the answer that because I do this work, because I want to have impact with my work. And only when I have impact with my work, it makes sense that I'm doing all this stuff with my research. But when I want to have impact, it's of course important that the work is of high quality. And so it's logical that I do have to follow responsible research practices, because otherwise my work does not have any impact on the real life. And I think that's really a nice question to ask yourself. Why? Why do you think it's important to follow responsible research practice? So what is your own motivation? Because then it makes it much easier to give priority to all this stuff, what we are discussing now, because it costs always a little bit time and effort. And sometimes you might think, okay, it's not really important. It's more important to have this publication, but not to share my data. But when you think in terms of, okay, but the publication is not the most important thing of my work, much more important is, for example, what it has finally for an impact, then responsible research practices become really important for you also. And of course, in all stages of your research. So let's discuss some principles, some general principles. It's quite general, it's very, very basic, but I think it's good to think about these basic principles, why they are important for you. And that's always in life. Think why it is important for you. And when you understand why something is important for you and your work, it's much easier to find a way to follow all these rules and to do all this stuff. Your why to do some pre-registration, particularly in the area of psychology. I think it's so important because 2 reasons. We have many, many small experiments. And a small experiment, you all know, it's really not enough to have a valid study to know something about the real world. We need much, much more studies than one small lab study. However, if you have a tradition to do about 10 studies with your students and publish only one of them with positive results, of course, we have a problem because there's huge publication bias. So think about why pre-registration is important. Of course, it's a challenge to pre-register every study you do with your students. So it is important to find easy ways to pre-register. But if you think in the consequences, it's really huge which type of publication bias. And this might be really more important in psychology because we have more small studies and we are doing so much teaching and doing so many studies with students together. It's even more important to think about good pre-registration where we can control for the type of studies. And of course, it teaches.
Great to have you back, and thank you for continuing your presentation.
Yeah, of course. It's indeed quite challenging, all this technical stuff, but it's nice, of course, to follow up on my presentation. So let's continue. I talked about pre-registration, and I think then there were some technical problems. So I will shortly discuss the other points. So some of this, of course, reliability. It's so important to think about reliable research. When you think, for example, about your own measures to use a reliable research, it's of course obvious in a way, but when you want to have some impact in your community. But how many times you have, of course, had some measures that had a little bit low reliability, for example, in terms of Prof alpha. So when you really think about the consequences, that it's not really a reliable measure of what you're doing then, and the huge consequences it has, it makes really a high impact. And you really think about it in a quite other way than only in terms of, okay, I have to follow these guidelines. So think about why should it be important for you to follow this reliability and being critical, of course, always about the existing literature, because there are many not reliable measures published in the literature. Of course, also reproducibility. We try, for example, now to replicate a study from 15 years ago. And it's so difficult because the standardization is not the same. Some measures are not longer available. So we enter really so many problems really to replicate the study and make it possible to reproduce it. So make sure that the work is reproducible, particularly in the area of psychology. We have these problems that we have these small studies, and one small study is never enough to make really have some evidence from what's really going on in the world. So we need more than your study. So it has so much more impact if you make it reproducible. And but then, of course, it's so important to use it also as an evaluation point in your career. That, for example, from the evaluation interview at your department, these characteristics, these criteria are also an evaluation criteria. And of course, standardization. If we do not standardize our labels, our data, our reports, there's really a huge problem to share our data. And that is not only able, of course, to do this on the large scale in your department or in the institute or with your international communities, but also on a small scale. For example, for the different PhD students you work with or in your department, discuss it with other PhD students, students. So start to standardize it as easy as possible, and it really creates much more impact. And this means that there's really another culture also, that we really think in other terms of transparency. That, for example, when I started my career, usually you did not discuss really what you wanted to study, which I always found very strange, because it's so nice to share these events, to brainstorm it, to see what other colleagues does. So I think it's much better that we emphasize now the transparency in our work, and already start with this transparency when you have a very good research idea for the next proposal. But of course, also our mistakes, our difficult things, our challenges. For example, when you look back, what you published before, from what were the struggling things, what were the challenges you faced in some studies. So let's share all this stuff and being transparent about all these different gray aspects in our work. And of course, I think interdisciplinarity makes it much easier, because then we are usually challenged also to think out our own discipline in a new way, from a different perspective. So it's usually when you work interdisciplinary, you are challenged by others also in terms of data management and responsible research criteria, because they're sometimes different. So it really stimulates to discuss everything in an interdisciplinary context. And of course, the sharing of our work, which is the main part of the symposium here together. There we have this open science communities, which are great. I'm so happy that these slides are also from the Open Science Community Leiden. This is a very, very active community, but there are many, many more in the Netherlands. They really follow the guidelines of that's much more transparency and an open research culture, which is really important for our community, not only in psychology, but in all disciplines. And these are the main criteria we that they are think they are important. And of course, they are also very much related, as I said before, from transparency to open data, reproducibility, and others. And these are the strategies how we can reach all these goals. And I think the most important is indeed to change the research culture. And to change the research culture, it seems to be a very big thing about changing the system and changing the organizations and the proposal system and so on, with the NWO and others. And that is true. But you can always start with yourself and change your own research culture in your own group, with your own colleagues, and making your own choices in this. And that, I think, is, of course, the most important start of this open science community, that the researcher makes their own decisions that to follow, or to try to follow as good as possible, all these responsible research practices. And the nice thing is that the open science community is a learning community. That means we are learning, we are all looking for the best solutions. And sometimes it's not always the best solutions. For example, it's the privacy issues and the sharing issues. And sometimes it's really contradictory, these two goals. So we have to make the best decision. But there is not really a black and white decision. We have to discuss it. So we have to learn from each other. And it means also we have to learn from our own mistakes. And these are some of the principles for what they're doing and why they're doing, that we really is a principle that we learn from each other, that we have to discuss, of course, the recent developments in it, but also in the teaching area. That's so important to share everything. And here you can see that it's really a community already very active in the Netherlands, also internationally, but particularly in the Netherlands. So we can be actually quite be proud that the Netherlands is really progressing so fast in this area and to have such an active community. So here's a website, for example, from Leiden University, and you can also put it on your website. Here, for example, my colleague Elko Fried, he's sharing then his expertise in this particular area. So it's very nice to see how people try to support each other and to share their knowledge. Here's a link to it. Then, of course, another is, of course, quality. In a way, quality is also seems to be very obvious, that we course, we want to follow and have the best quality of our work. Strange enough, we are doing always a lot in terms of quantity and not always in terms of quality, because sometimes it seems to be contradictory when we have to have so much output. It is not possible to have the highest quality standard. So that is, of course, really a huge problem. And in a way, it's so strange that, for example, quality should, of course, be part of the yearly evaluations, but it's not really part of it in a way. We are looking more in the quantity and the output of publications. So it's very important that we develop new criteria to really say how we can see what is the quality of the research, what we are doing. And of course, it's necessary then in a way to promote also slow science. And to reward, of course. Our reward principles, of course, a problem at this moment that people are not rewarded for responsible research practices or open science. And of course, it's always challenging to change the system. But what we can do, I think, is that we add specific reward criteria, like add this criteria for following responsible research practices, sharing data, open science, and all this stuff. So then it's not necessary that we change everything, but we can at least add some criteria to change, to making a step into the change of the culture. And of course, emphasize always a responsibility. I think it's also very nice in terms of teaching. So making students aware that they're responsible for data and that these data should reflect their reality. And that is, of course, only possible if you have high quality data. And so that you have a responsibility that your data have higher quality, and that, of course, you should follow the guidelines for responsible research practices. Of course, these all together might have an impact on our work, and I hope a very important impact also on society finally. But what we are doing by ourselves, I will give you a very short insight in what we try to do at our department, for example, to stimulate responsible research practices. For example, in the area of data management, when I came to Leiden University, I appointed a data manager because it was a regular part in the medical faculty. So I thought, yeah, it's a good thing because it costs a lot of time. And it's important that we have someone who does these things at the department, who helps the students and the senior researchers in data storage, open access. And now it's a regular part of the institute, so I'm happy. But it wasn't the case several years ago. And of course, then he or she has to follow all these guidelines and know all these guidelines, which is quite complicated sometimes. So it takes time, and I think it's very important that the institute and faculties have people who are responsible for this stuff that can help the PhD students, but also all senior researchers. So that's the argument that you do not have time for it is becoming less and less important. This is, of course, several criteria. What then, for example, a data management policy, that every PhD student has now to follow a data management plan and has to written it before the start of the research project. I think this is now part in many, many institutes also, in the Netherlands at least. And here you can see what we have for a particular process, what we do. When a new research project is started, then it should be registered with a data manager, and he or she checks on the data management plan, and he has a discussion with the researcher and to look whether some tasks, some responsibilities are checked. And after the first inclusion of the patients, and he checks all the data processing, which gives, of course, an important input on the quality of the research, and not only at the end of the research, but already when you include the first participant. I think that's very worthwhile to do. Then he has every half year a short digital survey about quality, and after inclusion of the final petition and the final check, and of course the final check of the publication package in the open access. Part of these then are the trial master file and the publication packages. Only for an example, the trial master file is what you see checking, is then that everything what's listed here, that it's in the trial master file. And of course, then they have a regular discussion on these points. And the same is for the publication package. It's a regular package at the end of the project. Then this is now part of our institute, that every everything have to be in the publication package when your project is finished. And like here are all the different things that have been part of the publication package. And of course, then it's stored and no changes are possible afterwards. However, these are some of the practices we are doing, but of course it's quite challenging always, because there's always a focus on inputs. There's a high work pressure. There's not really already a reward system where we really have a good criteria when people follow these responsible research practices. It's really part of the yearly evaluation criteria. And I think most important, we really have to discuss and look at a much more open culture still to discuss all these struggle, how to do is how we can support each other. And the only way is to discuss all these struggles also together and these obstacles and these hindering factors to make it easier and easier. And of course, to find more and more support system to help PhD students and senior researchers in this way of practices to finally have really an important input and increase the impact of our work. Because I really believe that when we change our culture and make it much more open, share our data, being transparent, being open about all these great stuff, it really has a huge impact of our work, and this will have a final impact on the societal impact of our work. Thank you for your attention and being still here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this really interesting presentation, for giving a perspective of how you deal with these things and to also try and increase the impact of your work. We are indeed a little bit over time with this event, but I would still like to give the participants possibility to ask some questions if you're okay with staying on for a little bit longer. So I'm just curious if there are questions, please put them in the chat. And I will wait a little bit because our live stream is a little bit of a delay to see if there are questions. I cannot see any questions at the moment, but we can wait a little bit and see if questions are coming in. Personally, I'm wondering, because you mentioned a couple of the challenges, what do you think is the biggest challenge we need to overcome if you have to think about your own work and sort of the different aspects that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think the most important is open culture. And the work pressure, of course, all this stuff we have to discuss and solve together. But the open culture, I think, is a prerequisite in a way to discuss everything together, what might be the challenging thing for you personally, and to make it part of the regular coffee time every day when you see each other. That you discuss a struggle and that we share all the difficulties we have, for example, when we plan a new research, but also, of course, the pressure we feel perhaps with the work pressure to have enough publications and all this stuff. I think the open culture is most important, that we change this culture from the idea that we only share our successes, but we also should share our failures and our difficulties.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree that is important for a lot of researchers. We have a few questions in the chat. One question from Judith Austin asking, what are the most common gray areas that you encounter?
Yeah, of course, I'm also only an average researcher, but I think publication bias is very important. Because, for example, I thought, oh no, we are usually publishing everything. And then I thought, I'll really check myself and all what we did in our research. And I said, oh no, we had a manipulation failure. And then we thought, oh no, that's not good enough to publish in a way. But then I thought, oh, but it's also important to have a manipulation failure. That others know that this is not worth to do then. And for example, we have so many student projects, and what is the criterion to publish all these things or not from a master thesis, for example? We should think about when is a master thesis a work we would like to publish or not. So particularly in the area of psychology, I think publication bias and related to pre-registration and also pre-registration of analysis, so that we do not explore everything and publish very low correlations which are not predefined, but that we really think in advance of a main hypothesis, and then also, for example, takes a room to explore everything. But if pre-registration makes it possible, of course, that we say in advance that this is our goal, and it avoids publication bias. So in the end, I think publication bias is particularly in the area of psychology is one of the biggest problems in my experience.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. There's another question from Hyperbers on your Datamanager. The question is it available for everyone at the social sciences or only for your group? And how is he or she funded?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's very challenging. When I started at Leiden University, I was head of the department, and I decided that we should have a data manager, and it was why we were really the first in our institute. But now every department has a data manager, so it's a very good development. We discussed it, of course, together with the professors and with other colleagues, and now everybody is convinced that a data manager should be part of the department, and I'm very happy that we agree on it. But it needed some discussion indeed. And I think it's very important to discuss it with the board of your institute, of your faculty, of your department, to discuss whether this might be possible, because it helps a lot the whole group, and it increases the quality of your work. And in the medical department, for example, it's really a regular principle that there's always a data manager. In social science, it's not always the case, but I think this will change during the next 5 to 10 years, that in every department there will be data managers. And now it's really an in-between period a little bit. But you can always contact us, of course, and perhaps we can help you to lobby for a data manager in your department.
Is it in a structural funded position that you have? I think there was also a question how the funding is made. Because
the funding, it's really from Eerste Geldstroom, it's from internal funding. It's really, and then there was always an argument from some professors who said but then we can't give the money to an associate or assistant professor. And a data manager is a little bit cheaper than an associate or assistant professor, but still then I think better you have to have a good support structure in your department, and it's better than to have perhaps even a little bit less money for the research, but the research what you are doing is of high quality, and data management is one of the criteria, I think, which makes it much easier to follow the guidelines and to have a high quality of your work. But of course, everybody should agree on it, and otherwise you can always discuss it also to do these things by yourself. If it's really not possible for you to have this support, then you can organize it also by yourself together with other PhD students. It might be possible, but I would always lobby for a data manager.
Thank you. I think we at DANS also lobby for more attention to data management. This was a very nice presentation. I would like to thank you and round this part off. So thank you very much again for your presentation and for hanging on despite the technical issues.